So let me say this, as I'm older than you, as I always point out when you're on the show, but I can see the difference in the generational view of things sometimes. So as an old lefty from the 70s, just imagine me in your class as a 20-year-old, okay? I take very seriously the abuses of the United States, the role the United States played in military interventions across the world, wars, bombings, coups, just a callous disregard for human rights. When Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 and took over in 1977, he pledged to follow basic human rights, and he was mocked and maligned by the establishment for being weak and naive. And then Reagan came in, and boom, all right, we're done with that human rights stuff, and we're interventions throughout Central America. And I watch with interest, David, some members of the MAGA movement, like going on the Joe Rogan show, for instance, and denouncing American foreign policy, using like a leftist perspective that I would have been, if you had heard 20-year-old Benny talking, it would sound, I'm like, oh my God, they're finally putting someone like me on the Joe Rogan show, but it's not me. And he's doing that to fire up a MAGA against the deep state, which is so bizarre because the foreign policy they're emulating would fit right in with what they're denouncing. Okay, this is part of the madness as they support dictators, and there is no regard for human rights. So I guess that's my challenge to you. If the American people who are only half paying attention at any given time to anything, so if it's foreign policy issues, they're only paying attention 10% of the time. They have a general notion that the United States had a war in Vietnam. You know, they may have an uncle or a grandfather who fought in that war. I mean, why should they take serious the notion that the United States is ending something good when we totally rearrange our foreign policy views?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? I mean, I'm part of the left, right? I mean, I think that like people on the left have had a fairly consistent, and I think, you know, pretty good critique of American foreign policy for many, many years. Particularly the tendency to back authoritarian governments when it's convenient to us, to overthrow governments that are unfriendly to us, the use of our military in ways that are inappropriate, to say the least, throughout the 21st century. But what I would say about like just all that stuff, including Reagan's coups, the coups that the CIA supported in the 50s and 60s and 70s, which were extensive and really damaged America's reputation around the world for good reason, is that like at least there was a rationale. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the rationale goes a little bit like, okay, we have to back these like right-wing authoritarians in like, I don't know, Guatemala, right, to prevent like left-wing tyrants from coming to power, right? There was a global struggle against communism, and the determination in the US was like, we would prefer right-wing authoritarian capitalists to like left-wing authoritarian communists. Okay. Now, I mean, you can pick that apart all you want, right? But like at the end of the day, the story we were telling ourselves was that like, we were making difficult choices and moral compromises to try to preserve the existence of liberal democratic capitalism around the world in the face of this, the sort of world historical threat emanating from the Soviet Union, right? And throughout that period, we maintained, at least a rhetorical commitment to democracy. We did a lot of democracy promotion around the world. And the expansion of NATO, creation of NATO, and then the expansion of NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union came with it a requirement that member states democratize, right? There's five core requirements to join NATO, right? And being a democracy is one of them. Civilian control of the military is one of them. Transitioning to a market economy is one of them, right? So NATO was used as a vehicle to integrate these former Soviet countries into the Western alliance, but also into the sort of like liberal democratic capitalist world. Okay? And we are in the process of walking back that whole commitment, not because we're trying to protect liberal democracy from some other malign force, whether that appraisal is correct or incorrect. We're walking back those commitments because we no longer believe in liberal democratic capitalism, right? The Trump administration is an authoritarian force. Like we elected malevolent authoritarians who sympathize with other right-wing authoritarians around the world, not as a bulwark against anything else, but on their own terms. Like the Trump administration prefers authoritarianism to democracy. Everything that they've done in the first 5 weeks of this administration is like another sign that they would prefer that none of the institutions that currently like even modestly constrain them, they would prefer that those things not exist, right? And so when you go, it's one thing to say like, we've got to end this war, right? Like millions of people are dying. It's a terrible thing. Like we can keep sending Ukraine money, but at the end of the day, they can't win. Russia can't win. Let's get everybody to the table and figure something out, which I think is completely reasonable, right? It's a completely reasonable way of looking at where that conflict is right now. Like there's been a lot of death and dying. It's very expensive. It's very stupid. And there may be a deal that could be had that is not ideal, but is better than the current situation. That's not what's happening, right? What's happening is the Trump administration is cutting the Democratic ally out of negotiations and basically agreeing to settle the conflict on Vladimir Putin's terms, which has implications like far beyond Ukraine. The idea that the United States, the leader of the NATO alliance, would publicly and unapologetically side with the principal adversary of the alliance, like the whole reason that the alliance was created was to protect countries from Russia. And for us to take the leadership of that alliance and say, like, actually, we prefer the Russian expansionist vision of its foreign policy to the UN Charter, to the commitments that we've made as an alliance. Like, of course, Ukraine's not in the alliance, right? Otherwise we would be at war. But we've been supporting them in a variety of other ways to try to preserve Ukraine's existence and independence, and to stop this sort of like Russian expansionism along its borders. And the signal that we were sending to Moscow is like, I mean, if you guys wanted to take like Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania back, like we're not going to stop you. Who listening to this broadcast really believes that the United States would like invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter if Russia invaded Latvia? Okay, like I'm not like Russia's in no position to invade Latvia right now, right? But the point is, like, we have sent an unmistakable signal to our allies. I mean, Pete Hegseth, our illustrious drunk defense secretary, said it out loud. He went over there and he was like, America will no longer be the principal guarantor of European security. Okay. And again, it's not because we're like, look, we'd like to offload some of this to you. Like, we think it'd be good to create an EU defense apparatus, and like let's have a little bit more equality in this relationship. That's not what's going on here. Like, we just don't care. I'm not saying we. I'm saying the people currently running the United States of America are malignant authoritarians who do not care at all whether countries in Europe are democratic or not. They do not care at all what Russia does along its frontier. They do not care at all if Russia swallows a bunch of countries on its periphery in flagrant violation of the UN Charter, and probably including members of NATO. So there is like massive panic in the capitals of Europe right now, because the dawning realization there is like, we wrote out the 4 years of the first Trump administration, right? Like the existing order was like sort of barely preserved, because people had Trump's ear and they talked him out of doing certain crazy things that he was considering, like withdrawing from NATO, which he was about to do at multiple points in his first term. So it survived, right? And it was like, we just need to get like a Democrat or some like pre-Trump Republican into office, and things will go back to normal. And I think that dream has been shattered, right? Because Biden did do that, right? Like, he shored up the alliance. Like, our support for Ukraine was responsible actually for enlarging NATO, bringing a number, like 2 countries that had resisted NATO membership throughout the entire post-war period, to decided to join the alliance, right? Including Finland, which is wild. And they just can't tell themselves that story anymore, Ben. And the reason is us. But the reason is you just cannot trust the American electorate right now, right? Like this malignant authoritarianism has taken over one of America's two political parties. And what people proved in November is that they just don't care enough about the existence of their own democracy to set aside like some irritation with like inflation or a visible migrant crisis. They just don't care enough about their own freedoms and their own democracy and their own commitments to prevent like people openly plotting to dismantle our democracy from taking power. We handed them the keys willingly. And if you're a leader of a small democratic European country, how can you ever trust us again? I mean, even if a Democrat wins in 28, the Republican Party is going to remain completely in the grip of this madness. And what our voters have proven is like we have no memory, which is like total collective amnesia, like a near total absence of like civic value, media literacy, historical knowledge and understanding. And so like they're going to have to just pursue other options, including Canada. Trump has been making noises about annexing Canada for like months now. Mm-hmm. Okay, and you can write it off as a joke, but the Canadians are not taking it as a joke. Like they're taking it very seriously. It's like throughout my whole career when I'm teaching, I point to the U.S. and Canada as like proof that there's more to international relations than just the sheer power. That like the existence of regimes that are ideologically compatible and friendly means that you can have a large, powerful state that won't just, for no particular reason, like conquer it and absorb its smaller neighbors. And that trust is gone. And I wouldn't be surprised if Canada and a number of other European countries pursued their own nuclear deterrence, undermining like yet another achievement of this post-war security order, which for all of its flaws and all the ways that we violated it over and over again, managed to keep the number of nuclear armed countries in the single digits, despite that like probably 100 countries have the technological know-how to do it. We've kept that club very small in ways that significantly reduce the chance of accidental nuclear conflict. And Trump is just like wantonly destroying that too. I'll stop because I'm rambling, but it's
well, you're not rambling. You're actually doing that was pretty good. We would call a riff. And you tied a lot of things together. When you brought up Canada at the end, it reminded me that last night, we're recording this on a Friday. On Thursday night, there was a hockey game between the Canadian national team and the U.S. national team. As all professionals, they play in the NHL, and I just it's kind of blowing my mind to be saying this, but that was viewed in the same context as the hockey game from 1980, when the United States in the Olympics stunned the world by defeating the Soviet team. And that was a cause for great jubilation in the United States, lots of flag waving. It came at the tail end of the Carter administration, right before this country elected Reagan. It came in part as a response, just a jubilation to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It's irony of ironies. Carter denounced that, canceled our participation in the Olympics, and then how many years later, David, the United States itself invaded Afghanistan. And you could say this for the Soviet Union's invasion. Well, Afghanistan is a lot closer to the Soviet Union than it is to the United States. This is why there is some legitimacy, I must confess, to MAGA ideologues, the things they say, the things they've been pointing out on the Joe Rogan show. So anyway, the United States is waving the flag to denounce the Soviet Union in 1980 in triumph over the U.S. surprising victory over the Soviet Union in the hockey tournament in the Olympics. Fast forward 45 years. I can't believe so much time has passed. And the United States is waving the flag over a hockey game against Canada as though they are our ideological enemies. Okay. And I'm like, are you kidding me? This is the most manufactured display of patriotism I can imagine. I've lived through a lot. And it's like, I'm rooting for the Canadian team in this one. I don't even follow hockey. I could not name one person on either. No, I know the one guy, Sydney. His name is Sydney. There's a Sydney somewhere. He plays for, I'm pretty sure he plays for the Pittsburgh Penguins. That's my knowledge of hockey. I do not know hockey. I don't follow it. But it's such a manufactured nationalistic crisis. It was Donnie Trump who picked on Canada, started trash talking Canada out of nowhere, David. I don't know. Maybe you can help me understand what he's up to with this. And then the Canadians respond quite naturally with outrage. And now we're supposed to be, as Americans, flying the flag in support of the U.S. hockey team. So when they can defeat dastardly Canada, and somehow or other that will vindicate Donald Trump's policies. David, it's utter madness. And whoever's going on the Joe Rogan show to denounce foreign policy and how we manipulated by our government to support all sorts of whacked out anti-human rights initiatives. I hope you mention this on your next appearance on the Joe Rogan show, because this is, you talk about a manufactured crisis. You talk about a manufactured appeal to nationalism that's void of any meaning. I would say this is it. Your thoughts about Donnie trying to stir America against Canada?
You know, I think we've reached the point where like trying to suss out some clear rationale for things that Trump is doing is just, it's like pointless, right? Like, I think that what we really all need to understand is that we, at this point, we live under the rule of like an erratic, you know, vaguely senile, mad king authoritarian. And whatever he's going to do when he wakes up in the morning is like virtually unpredictable. You know, tomorrow morning he could be talking about invading Mexico. Like, who knows, right? What the way to understand, like in a broader ideological sense, like what's going on here, in international relations terms, we have this phrase for countries called a revisionist power. That's what Russia is, right? If you're a revisionist power, what it means is that you want to change the status quo somehow, like to expand your borders, to reclaim lost territory, or in some other way to like aggrandize power for yourself. You know, so Russia's a revisionist power because they like what Putin wants to do is to undo a lot of the outcomes of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wants to grab as much territory from the former Soviet republics that broke away as he possibly can before somebody stops him, right? So undermining the NATO alliance or destroying it, as he's in the process of doing, like whatever he spent on the 2016 election has to be like the greatest return on investment in like the history of the world. You know, for a few $100 million, like he basically bought the destruction of the NATO alliance that was keeping him in check. So he wants to destroy NATO so that he's free to go take little pieces. I don't think he wants to like fully reconstitute it, right? But he wants to take pieces of these countries that have Russian speakers or ethnic Russians, or that, you know, like they play some part in like the mythology of Russian history, you know, in which like Ukraine was like the wellspring of Russian history. Like it's all like crazy stuff, right? But like fundamentally, like if you were like Vladimir Putin, your king for a day, he would grab pieces of like 16 different countries and reintegrate them into Russia. And so that means he's a revisionist power. Like he doesn't respect or want to uphold the existing borders. And that's what Trump is now, right? Trump has turned America, the most militarily powerful country in the history of the world, into like a malevolent revisionist power that wants to expand its borders. Right? Like we're threatening Denmark, a tiny peaceful democracy, which we've had like an unproblematic alliance with for 70 years, threatening to invade a piece of its territory, which is Greenland. I think largely the speculation is that because it looks big on the Mercator map of the world, like the like the rendering of the Northern Hemisphere makes certain things look bigger than they actually are, including parts of Canada. And so this is not something that we've experienced in the post-war world. Like, the United States has not tried to expand its borders since World War II. I mean, just think about that for a second, right? Like, the United States, like the signals that Trump is sending is like, we're not satisfied with what we have. We want the Panama Canal back. We want Greenland. Ha ha ha, like, we'll make Canada the 51st state. But he keeps saying it, right? And the more he keeps saying it, and they've like floated ideas about invading Mexico to destroy the cartels or whatever. And I don't think it's going to be long before they start talking about, like, you know, smash and grab, like taking pieces of Mexico to, you know, to secure it from the illegals or whatever excuse they're going to make. But the point is, like, in a broader sense, like take the Mad King's daily rantings out of the equation for a second, and what you have is a United States domestically unchecked for any restraints on his power or the exercise of his power, because Republicans have like basically capitulated completely to the most insane nominees that like I've ever seen people nominate to these positions, like Kash Patel. Like a United States that wants to revise its borders, very powerful, right? We have the same aggregate military power that we had when Biden was president, but we have like a nightmare psychopath in charge of the country now, and no one to stop him. So that's what's concerning to me.